Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
On today's program, we're going to air a keynote address by Mr. Jim Hood, the Mississippi State Attorney General, that was given at the 9th Annual Human Rights Banquet in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. In this address, Mr. Hood will be discussing his successful jury conviction of Mr. Ray Killian, a Klansman, on June the 21st, 2005, of the murders 41 years earlier of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi. After 41 years, there was a conviction for that murder, and Mr. Hood will discuss his case and the successful conclusion of that case.
I'm not shaking anyone's hands tonight because I'm under the weather, and I'm going to make it through this somehow. I've had fever last night and had it today, but I thank you, Lawrence, for that introduction. Lawrence has had battles with the Aryan Nation and as an assistant attorney general and filing these type actions, so he knows a lot more about your history and what's happened than I do. And in fact, we like Lawrence so much, he's going to be the president of the National Attorneys General Association, not next year, but the next. So we think a lot of him. Tony Stewart and the members of the task force, y'all have treated me wonderful and been so kind to put up with me today. I went down to eat lunch, and I've been staying in a beautiful hotel, and I hadn't even gotten a chance to get out and see any of the country. And I got to warn you, I'm taking antibiotics, Robitussin, Tylenol, blood pressure medicine. So I don't know what you may hear tonight. In fact, I've had my problems taking medications before. But about the time I made the decision to run for Attorney General, we were expecting my third child, and my wife had morning sickness, and so we'd been through a lot, and it was during duck season. I was out, trudging around in our sloughs where we hunt, and my heart was just pounding, and I hadn't taken my blood pressure medicine. It was the first month that I had been on the medication, and so anyway, I go back home and got the bottle down out of the cabinet, and I'm reading on the label, what it is to my pharmacist, and she says, well, don't worry about it. I said, we'll fill it, and anyway, I come back home, and I got the bottle off the counter about to throw it away, and I noticed it's got my wife's name on it, and so for 2 weeks I've been taking morning sickness pills, thinking I was taking blood pressure medicine. In my own defense, it was the same pharmacist, little white pill and a bottle, and apparently mine had flown off in the back of the cabinet off the Lazy Susan. But one of my Sunday school members was a smart aleck, he said, well, you probably got yourself in that position in the first place by taking her birth control pills, So, I want to tell you a little bit about how we came to be here. Tony was kind enough to invite me to come up here and speak after I'd tried this case in Mississippi. I'd like to tell you there was some great burning desire for me to have brought this case, but it wasn't. I was 2 years old when these murders occurred in 1964 in Mississippi. There was nothing in our history books about these murders, so it was. And the other aspect of it, when I ran for Attorney General, I didn't anticipate ever bringing this case. My predecessor, who I worked for, Mike Moore, y'all recall he did the tobacco litigation for Mississippi. He and our most famous trial lawyer, Dickie Scruggs, there. But Mike had the deputy sheriff who made the stop. If you'll recall a little bit about the facts, there were 2 young Jewish men who came from New York City and came down to Mississippi, and a black civil rights worker from Mississippi. They came there and they were stopped by a deputy sheriff, and this gang took them out and killed them and buried them. But the deputy sheriff who made the stop got in a little bit of trouble, and he came forward in 1999 and gave a statement to law enforcement, which it implicated all those that were still living. They were never indicted for this crime in state court. They were indicted for a federal charge, which was violation of civil rights, and the maximum penalty that was available for that crime was 10 years. Many of them were tried, many convicted, some acquitted, and one particular one, the main instigator, there was a hung jury, and he was a pastor, a so-called preacher, was the leader of the gang. A hung jury resulted in his trial. But this Cecil Ray Price, this deputy sheriff, came forward, gave a statement. 2 weeks later, he's in a cherry picker or a bucket truck there in downtown Meridian, and he falls out and dies. So we thought the case was over with, although we had the records preserved from that testimony in the 1967 federal civil rights trial. So people began to ask me, and it was a coalition of people from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where these murders occurred, that they called me in the first 2 or 3 months I was in office. And finally, I just said, and they knew I had a tender spot in my heart for victims. I had a first cousin who was murdered in 1976, and I had to sit through that trial, and I knew how victims felt. Their children and husband had been murdered, and nothing happened. So it was 40,000 pages in the file. FBI, J. Edgar Hoover sent in over 100 and something FBI agents, and they bought, beat, and stole just about any kind of evidence because nobody would give them any evidence. But once I read the record, I realized that we had probably sufficient evidence to put it before a jury. And the technical legal reason that hopefully, I give credit to my predecessors as district attorneys or as attorneys general, there was a problem with the evidence. So we had to find a lesser included offense because of murder. Murder, you have to prove intent to kill. So I kept beating on my criminal section back there, telling them to come up with some lesser included offense that we can try them on so the jury may go for the lesser included offense. And the reason was that there was some testimony by the star witness. In fact, he was one of them that was there. In order to avoid a state indictment by the state district attorney, who was probably a member of the Klan as well, I don't even recall who the DA was then in that area, the guy had to lie a little bit, and he said that, well, when he came down to Meridian, now Meridian is on our east Alabama border, and it's about 45 miles southeast of Philadelphia, and this particular witness attributed a statement to the defendant, Preacher Edgar A. Killen, called him Preacher Killen. What he said that Preacher Killen said was, we're going to go tear their butts up, meaning beat them up. And the problem with that statement is that if to prove murder, you got to prove intent to kill. And if you're just going to beat somebody up and something goes wrong and they die, that's not murder. So we had to find some statute that worked, and finally they came up with an old antiquated statute. We have about 20 statutes in Mississippi, and I'd been a DA for 8 years and for 5 years as Assistant Attorney General, but none of us had ever even heard of this statute. But it was felony manslaughter statute, and so what that was it said that if you commit a kidnapping and someone dies during that kidnapping, then it's felony manslaughter. Since then, our law has been changed to apply that to felony murder. In other words, it's death penalty murder. So once we found that, we knew we had some crime that if those jurors gave the benefit of the doubt to the defendant on the murder charge about to go beat him up, of course we knew we had all kind of evidence that it was a hit all along. I mean, they had a grave, they had a bulldozer to cover them up. They had to get plastic gloves and all those type things to get ready to go. But once we had that, I knew we had a duty to present to a grand jury. And as Lawrence said, it was mechanical. For me, I just did my job, and just let the chips fall where they may. Many people in Mississippi were saying, don't bring this, because people will think bad of Mississippi again. And that wasn't my job, to worry about Mississippi's reputation. My job was to do what was right and follow the law and present it to a grand jury. So we did that. And they indicted one guy, and that was this Edgar Ray Killen. He was 79 at the time. still just a rough edge old codger, and he's pretty tough. And what's so bizarre about it, he had preached the funerals of the judge, his parents, when they died. Of course, the judge had prosecuted him at one point, and the judge was a former DA who could have prosecuted him in that time period. So it was all very strange dealing with our judge in the case. I developed, after it was, got out that we were developing the case, we found out that there was a witness who wanted to talk to us. And he came forward, and he was sitting in the vehicle when the head of the Klan in Mississippi, in order for a local clavern, as they were called, they could beat people up, but they couldn't kill people unless they had clearance or approval by the head of the Klan. So this young guy, who was a kid, drove the head of the Klan to this meeting, and he was a witness when he gave the order for the murder. He came in, he gave us a statement to that effect, and it was great. Well, 2 weeks later, he walked into his office and sat down with a .357 and blew the top of his head off. So we lost another vital witness in the case. But we went on and presented it to a grand jury, and they indicted just the one guy. I mean, he was the one that never went to the pen, and of course, all his life it was a wink and a nod. He wanted to take credit for it and brag about it. A few facts about some of the bizarre things. When we indicted him, of course, he was brought up to the courthouse. His brother beats up a cameraman on film. I mean, these are some tough backwoods lumber hauling people, and he beats up a cameraman. And so here we go with the case. And it was more bizarre even after that. But I'm not going to go through all the facts. We started, it's 10:15 in Mississippi right now. So I know y'all don't want to stay here all night and hear about all the facts, but as I said, they chase these guys down and they kill them, and then they go bury their bodies, and they found them about a month later. So I wanted to try the case because it was close enough because of that legal problem I told you about. And two, about 10% of the people, I suppose, in any state are just pure racists. They just don't, like anybody who's different from them. Which I think is true in Mississippi. But they did some poll in that county where I tried the case, and it was about 70% negative to bring that suit. And there again, that in addition to that 10%, the 50, 60% felt like this is going to bring something up, and people will think bad about our area. And I think that's the common thread that we have with your area here and what you've been through. I tried a lot of cases when I was DA, and so I was more comfortable in the courtroom than I am in this environment or in the political environment. So I went over to try it myself. And two, y'all remember Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom back when I was a kid? It came on right before Disney. And Marlon Perkins was the narrator, and he would always stay at, while I stay at a safe distance, Jim goes in and tackles the alligator, And I didn't want to do that to one of my assistant AGs, so I went over and I tried the case, and it was, we had a cop. I read his testimony. I read his statement that he gave to the FBI in 1965, and he was a cop, member of the Klan, and he didn't testify. He testified at the trial, but he didn't tell half what was in his statement. I couldn't figure it out, and he didn't want. I went over and talked to him 2 or 3 times before we even indicted him. And he was a retired cop. I ended up being a exemplary law enforcement officer. But he just had that regret that he didn't go tell somebody, because he was in a Klan meeting when Killen announced that the order for murder, called elimination, had been approved. So we finally during the trial, I drove down to Meridian from Philadelphia and talked to him about 3 or 4 hours. And the guy finally went on and told the whole deal. In fact, the preacher Killen had given him the gun, and he got rid of it. So all that happens on the night before I put him on the witness stand. I got in closing argument, and every time as a prosecutor, you go over and you point at the guy and you call him, coward or something, And in closing argument, court TV was covering it, and the courtroom's full and all that. Well, I'm really getting on Preacher Killen for being a coward, not going and doing it himself. He gets his recruits and does it. And I walk over right in his face, and I'm pointing at him, and he goes, "You SOB," right there in front of the jury, And there's old lawyer swatting at him, trying to make him be quiet. And if I would have just thought and go, what did you say? You know, I just couldn't believe that this preacher, so-called preacher, said that before the jury. But, you know, unfortunately, some of the lessons and some of the parallels that we have in Mississippi and you've had here is that this Butler fellow, he did these things in the name of God, saying that God didn't sanction interracial marriage. That was their hot button issue and integration at that time. But this preacher, you know, used his skills as an orator, a Baptist preacher, to recruit people and inflame people and say that, you know, this is God's word. This is and I understand that that's what occurred here. And you know how many wars have been fought and people have died over religion or people who use religion. After the trial, a lot of it didn't get publicized after the trial. The guy got 60 years. He was convicted of felony manslaughter, 20 counts each. That was the max. The judge set a bond hearing about 3 weeks later. And we had two guys. At Meridian, Mississippi, there's an air base. And we do a lot of narcotics training there. And there were a couple of guys who had been doing the undercover course there that week. One was from South Carolina, and one of them used to work with one of my investigators. And they're in this bar just up there drinking beer a couple of miles from the base, you know, shooting pool. They're not doing any investigation. Well, this idiot brother, he is the one that beat up the cameraman. He comes in, and, you know, he's proud of himself, you know. You know who I am? I'm whatever his name is, brother of Edgar A. Killen, you know. Well, they start talking, and this idiot said, well, come on outside. I want to talk to you about getting rid of some people. And so these cops kind of perk up then, you know, and they're undercover. I mean, they got earrings on and everything. And they go outside, and this fool pats them down, you know, and then they're going, really? Well, this guy's serious. And then he starts talking about, well, I don't want it to be drunk talk. I want to meet you tomorrow, and I'll tell you who it is and what it is. So they did, and that investigator who knew my guy called him that night, and of course we wired them up in their car and everything. We were out there videotaping it, and this fool shows up. And he gets in, checks their car. I mean, checks their trunk for a repeater or any kind of wiring system. And then it comes to find out he wants to kill the judge. And I was disappointed. It wasn't me, you know, but he starts, you know, telling them that the old judge, there's two ways in and out behind his house. And he wanted them to come to the bond hearing. He said if he doesn't give my brother bond, let him out on post-conviction bond, then there's two ways in and out behind his house here. And all he does is sit on the back porch and drink whiskey, you know. And we got all this on tape. So I spoke at Philadelphia. That's the fair in Philadelphia. It's a big thing. It's an outdoor. Ronald Reagan, in fact, kicked off his second campaign for president there at the Philadelphia Fair. So I went over there and spoke, you know, and we had all this on tape. It was a legitimate threat against the judge. So I couldn't tell the other defense lawyers. Of course, they'd tell the brother we're trying to make a case on him. We didn't have one at that point because you can't conspire with a law enforcement officer. We couldn't charge him with conspiracy. We had to get an attempt. So to get an attempt, you have to have an overt act, which means something more than just talking about it, passing money or something. So they say, no, we're not going to go to this thing and to the hearing. We won't be near it, but we'll meet you the Saturday afterwards at the same bank where they met the Saturday after the first time. And so I go over and tell the judge, you know, and I take my investigators in, you know, and I'm telling the judge, look, Judge, I want you to deny bond, go back into chambers, set aside that order, put on record everything I've told you, and let's see if he meets them the next day. And then another judge can just read the transcript of the hearing. We won't object to anything and make a decision. And I thought I had him going, you know, but he was just a tough old judge, and he wouldn't do it. And he gave him bond. So I had to file all this under seal at our Supreme Court. And I think somebody at the Supreme Court called him and told him, you know, look, we're going to embarrass you if you don't, put this guy back in jail, because the national press was coming back in. And so anyway, we found out that some officers had seen him pumping gas and walk in and pay it. When he was in a wheelchair, nurse patting him on the hand the whole time during the trial and all of that. And of course, he had testified that he was, he was, bedridden and he couldn't do anything. So the judge revoked him, and now he's serving what will be the rest of his life. I think. I don't think he'll be successful on appeal. Thank you. Let me talk a little bit about some parallels that I see and some things that I learned. I kept the blinders on for the trial. I mean, the national press was just all over the case. They were just housed there in Philadelphia, so I had to stay on track. I don't know what they were supposed to teach me in law school, but the best I can figure is to separate your mind from your emotions. And as a lawyer, you can't let people bully. Some lawyers in the courtroom, they try to intimidate you or knock you off course. So we had to keep concentrated on what we had to do. But after the trial, people, of course, were asking me, what will the impact on this be in Mississippi? And then many of that 50, 60% that didn't want anything to happen said, oh, well, there must have been something to it, so I'm glad you did it. I'm glad. And the national press gave us a good check. In the past, they hadn't, and deservedly so, because of what had happened there. But they treated us fair. Afterwards, though, I went to the Anti-Defamation League of Washington, invited me and 3 other people to the Kennedy Center for the concert there, and honored us. And after talking to so many of those people, Jewish people, that were in college when that occurred, it was just a horrible image that they had of Mississippi. And, of course, they wouldn't have told me that except to say that my idea is completely changed about what Mississippi stands for and what happened there. And that's when I began to realize, because there again I was 2 years old, of the impression that act, that one case made of Mississippi. And many of you still probably think that there's Klan all over the place in Mississippi still, because where there's smoke there must be fire. Well, in fact, during the trial they had to import one from Georgia to sit in the trial, and he had a bulletproof vest on. He thought somebody was going to kill him. That the Klan doesn't exist in Mississippi. I didn't have. We were careful in what we did, but it wasn't, knock on wood, that great of a threat. But when Tony called and asked me to come up here, that was the only concern that I had, was some of the Ohio militias coming down, and doing something, because I knew our Klan wasn't around. Well, my first impression was, hey, in the Northwest up there, hadn't they got some gun nuts up there? Might be dangerous, So, and this civil suit that was filed and shut them down and pretty much just ran them off from this whole area. They left that stigma on you, just like that group of Klansmen. It was much more. The government supported, local governments and the state government supported the Klan in Mississippi. You didn't have that here. It was just a group that kind of moved in here. But it's caused you the trouble of that stigma. And I didn't know what state they were in. I just heard about the Aryan Nation being. I didn't know if it was Montana or where it was. But the point I'm making is that you have to continually keep up the vigil to remind people that that's an event of the past. And I think that's what's so good about this coalition and working together and continuing to do that, even after you've defeated it, because it can crop up. And for people who are contemplating moving here for economic development purposes, it makes a tremendous amount of difference. And that's how I noticed after the trial the difference that it made in Mississippi, people's images. And after Katrina hit and we were devastated by the hurricane, I saw a lot more outpouring of support, particularly from people from the Northeast. 3 Jewish law firms gave $100,000 to my office that we gave to law enforcement officers that completely lost their homes. I don't think that would have happened had not that jury convicted in that case. It wasn't anything that I did. I was just sort of doing my job. And so that image and what you do here, and I'm really impressed with such a large group that you have here to support. And I didn't understand, there are not many African Americans in this area when I was asked to come here, that you would have such a large coalition to fight racism. We have Choctaw Indians in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Neshoba County. That's an Indian name. The Choctaw Indians were from there in Mississippi, and they've developed a casino, and they've done really well. But they were mistreated by the Klan as well. They had a lot of the problems with the hate. In fact, none of them wanted to even serve on the jury. One thing I will point out to you, you have to be vigilant of people who come in the name of religion to your area. You have to be careful to protect your courts. The courts are where the little man can still fight against whatever interest it is, and I think by use of your courts, where people make those decisions and juries, to not put up with somebody like the Aryan Nation that moves in, it's vitally important to our democracy. I got some lawyer jokes, but I better lay off our lawyers. I think you're outnumbered. There were these 3 pastors that were killed simultaneously in the United States, along with their wives, in car accidents. And so all 6 of them arrive at the pearly gates at the same time. St. Peter tells them, today we're going to decide whether or not you get into heaven based upon your wife's first name. So the first one that walks up there is a Methodist preacher. And he says, my wife's name is Brandy. Lord, no, you can't get in here. You done had your mind on liquor. Next one walks up is a Pentecostal preacher. He said, my wife's name is Penny. Lord, no, you can't get in here. You done had your mind on money. And I'm a Baptist, so I'll tell it on us. A Baptist preacher taps his wife on the shoulder and says, come on, Fanny, ain't no way we can get in here.
You have been viewing a keynote address by Jim Hood, the Mississippi State Attorney General, who successfully prosecuted in 2005 a Klansman for the June 1964 killings of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It was a very powerful address. Please join us again next week when we will move yet to another issue on the North Idaho College Public Forum. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.
Great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web.